lot of items in it this morning. So what we're going to do is we're going to plan to deal with as many of the matters arising and legislation items as possible, in addition obviously to the briefing on the High Street Voucher. And then we will be seeking to get members' agreement to deal with the correspondence items and anything in matters arising that we don't get through via email, if members' content.
Agreed.
And then just a final item that's not in your packs is just to flag, members will be aware that yesterday I think an additional 25 million was allocated to Fibrous under Project Stratum. Yeah. And it's just to seek some information from the department in relation to that. And members will have had a number of briefings around Project Stratum, so it's useful to get that update. If members are content.
Yeah, just on that, yeah. I think that's useful as well. I know, having worked in organisations as well, may also as part of that update also to give a broader update on how the interlinking parts of the internet, the fast fibre sort of rollout is going, because obviously there are companies, Virgin and BT particularly, that are doing a sort of a commercial rollout. I know also they've been able to access the OpenReach side of things, where they get sufficient buy-in from an area which doesn't commercially mean that they can do the stuff, a sort of a halfway house between the Stratum and their own commercial with DCMS. But maybe useful as part of that update, they could also give us a bit of an overview on where we are sort of across the board in Northern Ireland. Because I appreciate probably as well there will be still some gaps there, although I think there is a bit of success story, and I think our level of fast fibre rollout will put us well ahead of other regions on that basis as well.
Yep.
Follow up on that, Chair.
Okay, thank you. So moving on then to item number 3, which is draft minutes. There is a copy of the minutes from the meeting held on the 7th of July at page 13 of your pack. So are members content that those are an accurate reflection of the meeting?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. So moving on then to item number 4, which is our departmental briefing update on the High Street Voucher Scheme. There is a clerk's memo at page 21 of your pack. There is a confidential letter from the Chair to the Minister regarding the voucher scheme at page 27, and then there is a response from the Minister on the voucher scheme at page 30. There is a letter from Nikki to Minister Lyons regarding the voucher scheme at page 32. A letter from the Council for the Homeless NI regarding the voucher scheme for those who are homeless at page 34. There is a copy of the committee's draft High Street Stimulus Scheme and 10X Micro Inquiry Report at page 37. There is a copy of the Department's research to inform the voucher scheme at page 61. A copy of the Jersey Spend Local Business Guide at page 116, and then a copy of the Danske Bank NI Consumer Confidence Index for Q2 2021 at page 118. So the clerk has issued the SL1 via email on Monday, and that outlines the secondary legislation that will be required to allow the High Street Stimulus Scheme to operate. The Executive Office owns the primary legislation, the 2009 Financial Assistance Act. However, delegated authority has been given to the Economy Minister to bring forward a statutory rule to enable the Department to operate the scheme. The High Street Coronavirus Financial Assistance Scheme Regulations NI 2021 SL1 that they received provides a full explanation of the nature and scope of the SR, which will follow probably next week. And just to highlight to members that the rule will come into operation on the 12th of September 2021 to allow the scheme to proceed on schedule and will be subject to negative resolution procedure. So this is the committee's opportunity to consider the policy set out in the SL1, to discuss it with officials, as it's not possible to amend once the rule has been made and laid in the Assembly Business Office. The policy objectives of the High Street Stimulus Scheme are to boost local economic recovery by injecting a 140 million financial package to stimulate spend in local businesses, to provide a stimulus to enable members of the public to purchase goods and services from local businesses that have lost revenue through the various periods of lockdown between 2020 and 2021 by December 2021, to inject funding to the business community that will lead to an increase through a multiplier effect in the overall economy by December 2021, and to protect local jobs in local businesses by December 2021. The High Street Stimulus Scheme will provide every person resident here aged 18 and over with a spend local prepaid card worth £100. The card can then be used in local businesses but cannot be used for online purchases, gambling or for certain financial and legal purposes. The exclusions will be listed in a schedule to the statutory rule and will be made publicly available on the Department for the Economy's website. The regulations will allow the Department to make a scheme commencing the 12th of September 2021 until the 31st of March 2022. The public can apply for the prepaid card when the application portal opens on the 13th of September 2021 until the portal closes on the 11th of October 2021. The prepaid cards can be used from when they are activated by the cardholder until the 30th of November 2021. A person is eligible to apply for a prepaid card if they are resident in the North and have attained the age of 18 at the date of applying for the card, or will do so on or before the 11th of October. The £100 will be disregarded for the purposes of social security benefits. A regulation is in the statutory rule to this effect. This has been agreed with the Department for Communities and the Department for Work and Pensions. This can only be done once, making a repeat of the scheme unlikely. The legislation must be operational by the 12th of September 2021 and will therefore breach the 21-day rule. So the committee will return to the SL1 for consideration following this morning's briefing.
Chair, I've just re-emailed the SL1 to members so they have it at the top of it.
Peter? Okay, so I am going to introduce our officials this morning. We have Brenda Burke from the EU Exit and Transition Group in DFE. We have Tommy O'Reilly from Economic Strategy Group in DFE, and we have Keith Brown from Economic Strategy Group. So I'm just going to hand over to yourselves to make an opening statement.
Chair, we also have Kyle Law and Jenny O'Hare on Starleaf as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to attend today's committee. And I would also like to thank members for taking the time out from the recess to come in and to attend the meeting. Okay, I'd like to start off by reminding the committee that following agreement that the Executive, the Department for the Economy was asked to take forward the development and implementation of this economically focused initiative. A project team has been working from the end of April with a target date of about 4 months to put in place a safe and secure digitally based system to allow for what's now estimated to be about 1.5 million people over the age of 18 to receive a £100 prepaid card, which could be used to purchase goods and services to support local businesses. It is envisaged that the scheme would run for about 8 to 10 weeks to finish at the end of November, and that any outstanding monies would be recovered from the prepaid cards as soon as possible after the closure date, and all accounts, etc., must be completed by the end of March. The committee are aware that this is an executive-endorsed scheme, and the policy objectives are clearly set out in the SL letter, and the Chair has repeated those. The scheme is a cornerstone of the Minister's Economic Recovery Plan, and it is appreciated that while some aspects, some policy decisions are in the scheme may attract comment from particular sectors or interest groups, this scheme has a finite budget and has to be delivered in a way that is both cost-effective, administratively efficient, and can be achieved within the timescales. This requires for boundaries to be drawn around the scheme and how the scheme will operate, and ultimately that is a policy choice for the Department and the Minister. The Executive decided that it is an economic initiative and allocated the funding to support it, and the achievement of the economic objectives as set out by the Chair and are set out in the SL, must be the guiding principles for eligibility for the scheme. We have asked for today's hearing to enable the Department both to fulfil a commitment we gave to the committee members at the 7th of July meeting, when we said we would return to the committee to have a broader discussion about how the scheme would operate, and might and should operate, and also to answer any questions that the members might have about the SL1 letter issued to the committee earlier this week. Before we get into the discussions and questions, I'd like to perhaps update the committee about where we are in the development of the overall solution, which will help see the implementation of the High Street scheme. We are working towards a September date for the launch of the scheme, and since we last met in July, the Department has been working to recover the 6 weeks lost during June and early July. There remain significant challenges to be overcome, if we're to be able to successfully deliver the scheme, and the project continues to have challenges and risks, many of which are similar to those that the committee were made aware of at our last hearing. The committee will also be aware that the Minister recently relaunched the scheme under the Spend Local banner, and this rebranding has proved extremely popular, in particular in towns across Northern Ireland, where local business leaders have welcomed the move away from the High Street city focus towards a broader definition of what the Department is trying to achieve. The Spend Local approach will continue with the soon-to-be-launched communications programme, which will have a focus on encouraging people to use their card to spend £100 in local businesses. And we can talk about the definition of local businesses, if you wish, during the questions. Whilst giving people as much freedom as possible to spend the money where they wish, the Minister does want to see the benefits of the spend being spread right across Northern Ireland and not just focused on the high streets in the cities. The spend should also be happening across a range of sectors and not just in retail outlets. And these will be the focus in the communication messages of encouraging people to support their local, small businesses, independent businesses, helping them recover from the effects of the pandemic. The SL letter sets out the Department's current thinking about how the scheme might roll out and eligibility for the scheme, but these are the earliest dates by which anything will occur. And we're continuing to finalise the technical, the operational and the legislative details to be able to give the Minister an assurance that the scheme can be delivered in a safe and secure manner. Clearly, the final dates will be set out in the regulations and laid before the Assembly and considered by the Committee at some point during September. I'll try to be succinct about the information I'm going to give the Committee on the progress with the scheme to allow sufficient time for questions. The standard customer journey is now largely defined and is broadly set out in the SL letter. We're continuing to work with the voluntary sector in developing solutions which will meet the needs of the most vulnerable groups in our society, such as the homeless, asylum seekers, disabled people, and elderly people who are unable to physically access local businesses. We're happy to discuss the work we've been doing in these areas and the comments we've been receiving from the many voluntary and community groups, as well as business groups with whom we've been engaging. The technology solution is making good progress, and the portal is currently undergoing an extensive set of technical testing to ensure it is both robust and can handle the expected rush to make an application to get the card. We're estimating a significant number of eligible people will make application in the first 2 weeks. And we will be encouraging people to use the digital portal because it will be easier to use and it will help you get the card quicker. The work on the verification process is also making good progress, with all of the data sets to be used now largely finalised. And we're currently building the pathways to connect the different data sets to ensure the system rolls out smoothly. This also needs to go through a series of tests to ensure it all works, and there are no significant weaknesses from a security or process perspective. In terms of the data sets, we will be using not only the electoral register to check people's application, but also the Driver Vehicle Licence Agency and the Department for Community Systems to check the information which we have been provided on the portal. We'd also like to thank all of our colleagues across the departments for their support in building the solution. We have had challenge in putting in place a digital proxy, or more commonly known as a telephone support service, and this work is one of our key priorities at the moment. We're presently undertaking a procurement exercise to identify a partner to help deliver this solution, and if we can get through the procurement completed soon, we are confident it will be in place for when we need it to be available. The prepaid card provider has swung into action very quickly and has helped us to make up some good progress in making up some of the time lost earlier this year. The card design is signed off, and they are soon to start manufacturing the cards. We're currently agreeing how and when the data will transfer from the Northern Ireland ICT solution to their systems. They have put in a rollout plan for the delivery of the card, which we're currently discussing with them. It will not be a launch of 1.5 million cards all at one point, but will require to be a phased rollout. There will also be a number of channels by which people will be able to activate their cards, and there will be a customer telephone line for lost or stolen cards. They have the necessary systems to ensure cards are not only used to purchase goods and services in Northern Ireland, but a comprehensive suite of real-time reports are in place to monitor not only spend, but also where and with whom. This is also being supplemented with an extensive suite of fraud reports on the spend. Chair, I think I'll finish at that point, and I think that Brenda and I and Keith are happy to take any questions that the members may have.
Okay, Tommy, thank you very much for that comprehensive overview, and you have addressed some of the points that I'm sure members will have questions about, but that they may want to go into a wee bit more detail. You mentioned in your briefing the research that we have been provided with, that is available online as well, that has informed the development of the scheme. And we had some discussion about that with the Minister last week. I mean, it might just be useful if you could set out in a wee bit more detail some of the, I guess, assumptions around the timing of the scheme and I guess, what it is intended to do, or how it is intended to get people back into shops and get people back out actually spending again in the high streets, as opposed to online, and I guess some of the behaviour changes that have resulted from COVID and the lockdowns that obviously we've all been under over the past year and a half. And just, I suppose, a couple of questions that just in relation to the actual application process and the verification of data. So we know that the electoral register, for example, is being used to verify data primarily. So is it a one verification? So if you're on the electoral register, is that you verified, or are the other ones used to supplement that as well? And I have been asked a question about if you're not on the electoral register and you have a driving licence but it's out of date, for example, will that be okay in terms of verification of data? And then I have some questions, I suppose, that are a little bit more direct, so I'll come back to those in a wee second, if you maybe want to pick up on those couple first of all. Okay,
so maybe we'll break the responses down into two, and we'll take first of all around the research. Brenda and Keith can also jump in on this. So in terms of the research that was carried out on behalf of the department, clearly the two big issues that we were really looking at in that research was one around the timing of the scheme, and the second was around what had been the impact of the pandemic, were two of the big objectives. It was quite, in terms of the timing, the research came back and said that we should be trying to launch the scheme at the end of the summer, beginning of September, around that time. But they were also very clear that they also said that we also need to take into account the particular circumstances in Northern Ireland, that the previous scheme, which they had looked at, in particular in Jersey, was of a much smaller scale than what is in Northern Ireland, and trying to ramp up this programme in that period of time, they also recognised that there were significant challenges, operational challenges. So in terms of the spirit of the research, we're still staying with that, in the sense that we are trying to cover that period between the end of the regulations and the build-up of that latent demand, and broadly before we get to the major Christmas spend. And that's the reason why we're still working on the basis that we should get the scheme launched during September, and it's a policy. In terms of the behaviours, it's quite evident from the research that there's been a significant change in the way that consumers have been purchasing goods. I think they estimated that there had been the speed of change had happened in 1 year, which effectively they would normally expect to see over 5 years. Okay? So for the amount of people going into the shops, they also reflected the unwillingness of people to go back to the shops, or back into retail outlets, into the town centres, into the city centres. And so really what this scheme is trying to do is, in a sense, to try and sort of move that back, trying to change the behaviours by encouraging people out, which is part of the reason why local businesses have been so encouraged by the scheme and really want to support it in trying to help people back into the shops and back into help. One of the discussions we've had with the retail outlets, or with the business sectors, and in particular the shopping centres, has been around the timing issue. And I know that, Chair, you've raised the issue about the spend at the end of November. And one of the messages they were giving us very clearly was that they recognised that it might be doing some displacement of some of the Christmas spend, but more importantly for them was It was about changing the habits, changing the behaviours of people and getting them back out again. And that really was their big focus as well. Okay. Brendan, do you want to comment any further around the research?
Yeah, I suppose the only thing I would say in terms of in the spend, the evidence has been from the Jersey scheme that people will tend to spend, in the first couple of weeks. And the scheme will be open for a lot of people for a much longer period than 6 weeks. So we don't anticipate that there will be a large percentage of spend within that Christmas period in November. And we do intend to do some modelling, using statistics from Jersey on that, and we can update you in correspondence with that.
In terms of the verification process, Chair, moving through that, so in a sense, you're correct that once you're verified, you don't go through the rest of the steps, okay? So once verified, and if you can imagine it as being almost like an elevator going up, right? The first floor is the electoral office, and we will send the data all to the electoral office register, and we will match against that. Those who are matched, then they will go off to be paid or get their card. Those who are not matched will then go to the next step. And so we whittle the numbers down as we go up each of the floors, in a sense, and driving that down, okay? So in terms of the electoral office, we know from the Chief Electoral Officer that they have received somewhere in the region of about 900,000 updates. So they've had a very, very successful registration process in terms of people updating the electoral office register. And that helps us as well. So it's a win-win for both them and also for ourselves.
Can I just ask on that? So we had previously been told that people had to have registered, I think, by the 10th of August to be on the September update, to be, to be on the register, to be verified that way. Obviously, the portal's going to be open until mid-October. So is there still an opportunity for people to get onto the register if they register now for the October update of the electoral register?
We are at the moment talking to the electoral office. They have provided us with the June update, which we're testing against. Right. The plan is that we will then get the August update for our first run in terms of that. But we are hoping to get the September update as a further addition. But we haven't finalised that with them at the moment. But that's a discussion we're having.
Sorry if I can jump in just on that point, because I think it's important. It's clear on the record. Because there was, I know, I think a number of folk there was a slight degree of misunderstanding at one stage. So it's not just, if you like, the update of those who are putting on, call it the new register, but it's also actually those who've been currently registered under what might be described as the old register.
That's correct, Peter. That's correct.
All those bits will be able to be used.
They've had 900,000 updates on the old register. I mean, we need to separate out the reason why we're using the electoral office register as against what the electoral office are going to use it for. So from our purposes, we're getting the old register updated in terms of all the new updates. So it's the most up-to-date one that we're getting. And we are working to see if we can get September cut before we go live in order to use that as well. But that's a discussion. It depends on the electoral office and where they are with their process.
Okay. And the October update?
Sorry, that's where the October update, but then it will come into us. That's the way that they're cutting it. We won't have the October update in terms of the one that's available in October. We'll have the September one.
Yeah,
September one, yes.
And I suppose the point is that of the 900,000 newly registered, we know they're accurate records, but those whose details haven't changed from the old register, there will be no issue in terms of verification.
So going to the next one in terms of DVLA, again, if you're on the DVLA database, in terms of your records are there, then we will check again against that, against a set of data. Specific questions you've asked, Chair, around whether if their driving licence is out of date, whether they're still on the database, I don't know. Well, I need to check that. And so happy to come back to you on that particular point.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess just to pick up on a couple of other points in relation to the actual spend. So, for example, this will be like any other card. People can use it as many times as they want. There's no registration process for businesses. It'll be any business, I guess, that has a card machine in their shop or premises. And then the types of businesses, there are no exclusions. For example, it will be beauticians, hairdressers, dressmakers, anybody basically that is a service provider that has a bricks and mortar premises. That's correct?
And the Minister's stated policy remains as it is in the context of exclusions for online purchases, for financial services in terms of paying your mortgage, your credit cards, and some legal services in terms of paying fines paying alimony, whatever, those sorts of issues. So all of those will be excluded. The full list will be provided, but in the main, the Minister is trying to provide that people will have the greatest access. And we, as we said earlier, it's not about retail. As you've said, it's a whole range of other services and outlets that we want to support.
Okay. And then just finally from myself, before I hand over to other members, we had previously discussed with you a couple of months back about making the card available to 16 and 17-year-olds. And at that point, you had said that it wasn't finalised. And I just wanted to ask you again, is that something that is still under consideration? Obviously, there are a lot of young people who, who may live independently, who may work, and in terms of the actual, I guess, verification of data, who would have national insurance numbers and who would perhaps be on some of those other databases that you will be using for verification. So is that something that is still under consideration?
So the policy is, Chair, that we are only making the scheme available to those who are 18 plus. And the reasons really are set out is that in terms of the scheme, there are clear reasons why we shouldn't be opening it up to those who are under the age of 18. And we have to draw up some boundaries around that. Now, we're continuing to provide some final guidance, some final policy advice to the Minister, but that's where the policy sits at the moment in terms of trying to ensure that the scheme can be delivered as efficiently as possible within the timeframes and within the overall budget. So it is. If we're going to give £100 to every adult eligible in Northern Ireland, and our most recent estimates from NISRA is that the numbers have now gone to about, for this year, we're estimating about 1.5 million. So we've only got 140 million in that. So there's a very thin margin in the middle of all of that. And you also take into account the issues around actually administering the scheme.
Okay, and I guess I would just make the point that I guess 16-year-olds would be considered working age for NISRA's purposes, and in terms of the actual intent of the scheme and the aims of the scheme, in terms of bringing people back into the shops, that younger cohort has, I guess, been one of those, one of the age groups that has been, whose behaviour has most changed as a result of COVID and I guess other, just behavioural changes in general. And in terms of bringing a different cohort of people into businesses to actually, generate spend and to deliver on the aims of the scheme in terms of supporting businesses in the local economy, that would also benefit in terms of including that age group?
Charlie, we fully appreciate there's an argument around this point, so there is. But ultimately, the department has to make a decision in relation to the overall policy that it's trying to achieve. 16, 17-year-olds are not considered as adults, right? And the question then is, if you go to, under the legal definition, they're not adults in Northern Ireland. And in terms of you go below that, then it's 16, 17, why not 15s, why not 14s? There's an argument that rolls down. I think what we're trying to do is say, we need to draw this boundary around somewhere that will ensure that we can deliver the economic benefits that we've been asked, that the department has been asked to deliver, and that's where it's got to in that sense. So policy has not been all finally nailed down because we are giving our minister some further legal advice around this issue, but that's where the policy stands at the moment. Okay.
Well, look, I'm going to bring in other members here to pick up on some of the points. John O'Dowd is first in.
Okay, thank you, Tommy and Brenda and Keith for your update. I think there's two debates to be had around this scheme. One is, should it be the cornerstone of an economic recovery action plan, and what long-term benefits it will have for the actual economy. I work on the basis that for every £1 million spent, that employs between 25 and 30 teachers, or 25 and 30 nurses, or others. So the long-term impact of that would be more beneficial in my opinion, but I accept this is a 1 year spend, and employing a teacher for 1 year has certain benefits, but not. Yep. So, but that's a debate for another day. In terms of the scheme, I think it will be very welcomed by hard-pressed workers and their families in terms of that additional £100, and I welcome the fact they've taken on board the concerns I raised at a previous committee around it not being weighted against anyone who's on benefits. So we've done a lot of work on that, and fair play to you. I have a couple of questions. Firstly, in the letter to the committee dated the 23rd of August, it refers to Minister Lyons has subsequently confirmed that he's content to continue implementation of the scheme under the ministerial direction, the previous ministerial direction, but is also seeking a further ministerial direction to cover off any potential overspend. Why would the Minister at this stage be seeking a ministerial direction to cover that? Surely the scheme has to use sufficient time now to budget this scheme out. A ministerial direction is not commonly used, as you'll be aware. It's the Minister looking to override the advice of his senior ministerial official. So why is the Minister seeking that at this stage?
So I think, John, it's I'm not trying to make a big issue out of this in the sense of, so the executive agreed that the former minister could issue a ministerial direction because the accounting officer at that stage advised that the value for money aspects of it, he couldn't provide assurances to the minister that was going to demonstrate value for money. That was a given, right? The allocation of 145 million was given to the department, and that allocation was then divided up into 140 million for the spend and 5 million for the administration of the scheme. Okay? Since then, some things have changed as we've gone along, such as the figures that we were working on at that time were about just over the 1.4 million in terms of the population over the estimates over the last couple of years. NISR are now advising us 1.5 million. Right? Whenever you start then taking into account the likely uptake in Northern Ireland and the likely spend, we're talking about that can range from anywhere between 95% up to 97, 98% uptake, 98% spend. Whenever you start to get all those figures, the numbers get very close to the 140 million. As well as that, in terms of rolling forward, we've had some issues around in terms of trying to put in place all the necessary support mechanisms to verify 1.5 million people's identities, to make sure that there's processes to support all of that. The provision of a telephony service, which we haven't budgeted for, but we're unable to get it from within the NICS, and so we're having to go out. The accounting officer really felt that there was an issue about he as accounting officer, whether he was going to breach that amount of money. And this is only a matter of what he's trying to do is ensure himself properly that he has got cover for that if it does break through the overall position. The money's not going to be coming from anywhere else, any other services. The department is going to deal with it within its own resources. Right? So this is, in a sense, an administrative arrangement that we need to put in place, and that's all the Minister's doing in that sense. And what he's doing here is in keeping the committee informed that that's what's happening.
In terms of forecast of a potential overspend, is it 1 million, 2 million? What sort of figure are you thinking at this stage?
So I don't think, we're not expecting there's going to be anything significant. It could be in the region of 2 to 3 million, just depending. But again, we're very much in the sort of lap of the gods in the sense of how many people apply for it, how much they spend, right? And that's really where the big issue is for us, and we're just having to work through that. We've done a lot of the forecasting. That's all done. We're not envisaging that there's going to be an overspend. We're envisaging there will be an underspend. However, the accounting officer does need to protect his position, and he just wants to ensure that there's cover there that it won't impact on the rollout of the scheme as we go forward. And the Minister's taking that back to the executive in line with the protocols.
Okay. In terms of overall consumer spend in the areas where this card could be spent, have you a general figure how much the populace spend per annum?
Per annum?
Or even, it has to be billions.
I'm sure. But I'm happy to find out. I'm sure NISR, with some figures around the total consumer spend.
I suppose the point I'm trying to get into is how much of an...
we provide
for your
some
average
figures.
family, £100 is a significant investment.
Yes.
And very welcome.
Yes.
So it's very welcome. It goes back to my original point. How much of an economic impact is this scheme going to have, and could the money have been better used for long term? So, except you don't have the figures.
No.
So if the average, the consumer spend is quite significant, and I would estimate billions. What impact £145 million is going to have on the business sector is questionable.
So this is about both in supporting local businesses recover. Right? This is about giving an injection into those organisations. We don't have the total figure for you at the moment. We did provide a figure to the committee in terms of the response to the last question around some estimates from England around the Christmas spend, right? So we did in terms of our response. But this is about changing behaviours. It's not all about solely about the 140 million. It's about reinstilling confidence, both in the business sector, amongst the local population, and trying to move us back part along the process back to normality. Right? Everyone is welcoming the fact that it's an assistance. It's not going to solve the problem. It is a stimulus scheme. It's about putting the money into the system, and we will get a multiplier effect. There's no doubt we'll get a multiplier effect. Currently estimating at about £1.42 for every pound spent. But that will help inject further spend in the economy, which is part of the reason why we're trying to avoid the displacement of the Christmas spend. Right? But ultimately, and you'll see the communications message, it is about that change in people's attitude, because the research has shown that people are not going to go back to the shops unless we can help do that. And we do need to get our towns and our cities back working as quickly as possible. And this initiative is part of that process.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I also add to that, just in terms of, I take your point in terms of the impact of 140 million in terms of total consumer spend, but we're for a lot of people talking about an increase in disposable income, and not just, for a lot of people will genuinely need it to pay for their daily goods and services, but for others this will represent quite a significant increase in their disposable income, and therefore will inject into those businesses that haven't seen a lot of that over the past year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mike?
Well, Chair, thank you, and thank you all. First of all, to sort of dot the I's and cross the T's, Tommy, a couple of questions just for clarification. The exclusions are not yet listed. Why is that?
Well, to be honest, Mike, they will be listed. It's just we haven't put them into. There are drafts in the current regulations, but they will be listed in the regulations, so they will. Okay.
So you know what they are?
Broadly speaking, I do. I can't remember every one of them, but I can remember most of them. So yeah. Okay. So they say sort of things like credit cards, mortgage payments, those sort of things are there. There are about, in terms of, I think there are about 350 codes in terms of the merchant codes, which splits out all the spends that people can use, and we've been through every one of those and ticked the ones that they're not allowed. Okay, and that's available as well. That will also be in the schedules in terms of the legislation.
So it's anticipated at the moment.
Okay.
It'll be available.
Perfect, thank you. You're also saying that the statutory rule will be considered to ensure compliance with Section 24 of the Northern Ireland Act of 1998, which is EU law and conventions. Why has that not happened yet? Are we not a long way down the road?
It just hasn't happened at the moment because the legislation isn't finalised. So obviously, as we're going through the policy questions, we're applying that to them. But once they're finalised in the SR, then the whole document will be considered in the round.
Any concerns to date about compliance?
Not on the current policy inclusions, no. I think the policy work behind that in the rationale and development, some of the stuff Tommy's listed, has been quite thorough. So,
okay.
And we're taking legal advice at all steps on that.
Right. Tommy, you mentioned in your briefing that we might have a more detailed discussion about the definition of qualifying outlets. Could we do that now?
Yeah, certainly. So from our viewpoint, the only outlets that we are not including are the financial services and those legal services we talked about. We are allowing for nearly every other business in Northern Ireland to be able to use this service. The only criteria around that is they must have a merchant code and they must have the merchant machine in order that people will be able to swipe or insert their cards, and otherwise it'll be just as ease of use as anyone uses credit cards or debit cards today. We are very keen to support local independent businesses, so some of the larger retail outlets, people will need to use that, as John has pointed out. Families will want to use that for buying their weekly shop, okay? And that they're perfectly entitled to do that. But I think what we're trying to do is encourage them to use local independent businesses, small businesses, support them, because this is really what this is about, helping those organisations recover.
But you can only encourage, you cannot demand.
And now, to be honest, as a department, it's not really our role to be prescriptive in the sense of where people can spend their money if we're trying to stimulate the local economy right across Northern Ireland.
In terms of this portal, when it goes live, up to 1.5 million people,
Yes.
including in Israel, could try to register.
Yes.
Is there a number at which that portal collapses?
So at the moment we're testing it, so that we're running the loads at the moment in terms of how many people. I'll give you the figure that we're currently working on. We're currently working on that it will be able to do 600,000 in a 12-hour period. Okay, about 50,000 an hour is what we're stress testing it against. Okay, now if 100,000 people all go on in the first hour, you know they're all not going to be able to get on it, but there will be 50,000 people who will be able to use it concurrently. And that, remember, we're talking about that this is roughly a 5-minute application process. Right? And that's what we're talking about, because we're talking well, the way that the process would work would be you would have to register in terms of your email address, but once you're in the system, about 5 minutes. You're putting in sort of a limited amount of data, and that data, once it's in, then that's fine, that's it. So there's no, as part of the process, there's no uploading of photographs, uploading of utility bills, none of that some of the other schemes had difficulties with, and appreciate that. This is a relatively quick process once you get into the system.
Is there an optimum percentage in terms of uptake from your point of view?
We recognise that there are a group of people in Northern Ireland who will not be able to use the internet or who will not have access to the internet, and we want to make the telephone service available to them. The telephone service will be only a digital proxy, so whenever people ring up, they will input the data for them. But we want to encourage everybody to use the digital system and only use the telephone service for those people who need it. Right? That's what we're trying to get to. So we want people on the digital proxy, on the digital system.
I think that there's probably a credible argument that would say there are certain people who probably don't need or maybe even deserve to benefit from that £100, such as, for example, MLAs on our salaries. But as you say, it is a stimulus package.
Yes.
So for us not to stimulate goes against the policy objectives.
Yes.
Is the card transferable?
So the card can be used by someone else if they have the permission of that individual. And similarly, someone can register on behalf of someone else if they have their personal details and they've been given their permission. Limited numbers, Stuart, in terms of security. But again, we do have issues around elderly people in residential homes and care homes and in their own homes, and their families do want to be able to register for them and get them their card. And we are trying to ensure that as many people in the adult population get access to the card and not exclude anyone.
Finally, I'm wondering what happens to any potential underspend on the 30th of November, because Brenda, you suggested there was a significant number of people who would have more than 6 weeks in which to spend.
Yes, those who get their cards in the first rollout will have longer than 6 weeks. So once the cards are issued, you have up to the 30th of November to use your card. So some people, depending on when they have applied and when the cards are rolled out, will have a longer period of time.
Beyond the 30th of November?
No. If for example, if you are in the first phase of the rollout, so say, for example, you were to get your card at just early or mid, end of September, for example, you have a couple of months to use your card up to the end of November. So hopefully we would anticipate that those people who get their cards earlier will spend earlier. So although they can use it up to the 30th of November, the balance will be very low at that stage.
So the spend stops on the 30th of November?
Yes.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just see in relation to having somebody's permission to register for them, is there any safeguard around that? So, for example, I'm thinking of coercive control in the home, for example, and somebody could take somebody else's card by registering for it. Is there any safeguard around that?
So the safeguards are that, in a sense, whenever you register, there is a slightly different route by which you go through in terms of you have to say that you're applying on behalf of someone else. Okay, you have to put in some of your own details into that process. But remember, Chair, in the sense of this card is £100. In the circumstances that you're talking about, those debit cards, those credit cards that are in people's homes at the moment are also available. The £100 once spent, that's it done. There's no more than that. Okay. Whereas if people is under coercive control, people who are subject to abuse, if they keep people's debit cards, they can keep spending the money on a continuous basis. And we've got a control around that issue. If someone feels that they are being forced, there is a mechanism for them to ring. There's a number for them to call, and we will stop the card as well.
Thanks for that, Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, and you're very helpful information to date. First of all, can I thank you for the work that's been done, particularly with regards to the disregard for benefits. I think that's a very important point that many people have been contacting me about, and I'm delighted that has been clarified for us. In relation to describing this as a cornerstone of economic recovery plan, is that seriously how you do describe the scheme, as a cornerstone? I can see it as, and I understand the arguments you're making about it being a building block in reinstating confidence in our economy. But surely there are multi-million-pound more important schemes than this to be spent in terms of supporting business, in terms of supporting people in employment and to get into employment going forward at all of this. It just seems to me to be a rather dramatic statement to describe this as a cornerstone of economic recovery.
And so I think that there are lots of policies, lots of initiatives being taken place within the department to support employment, to grow the economy. The Economic Recovery Action Plan is a specific initiative that has been taken by the Minister for the Economy and supported by the Executive. And there was a financial package put together to fund that, which I think was in the region of about 285 million, of which 145 was set aside for the High Street scheme. So that other remaining residual package is being used in a range of other initiatives to support the economy, support the economic recovery from the pandemic. So there are a range of policies being taken forward by the department, and this is one of them in respect of the economic recovery.
I have a series of questions, Chair, just not in any particular order, and some of it you've already touched on in relation to fraud or potential fraud, but it's a two-way street.
Yes.
There are the potentials that have been raised by the Chair and others around vulnerable individuals, whether it's coercive control, whether it's somebody who hasn't got all the capacity to actually do this for themselves, perhaps somebody with a disability or somebody who is elderly in a nursing home or similar care situation. So just to be sure how well protected that group of people are. But the other side of that coin is the potential for fraud coming from businesses using the cards. So what areas have you identified that need protection? I mean, I'm aware, for example, as I understand it, card companies disapprove but can't actually stop. There are some small businesses which you will go into for very obvious reasons. It's because of the card charges that are made to merchants that they will have a minimum spend. So is there a guarantee that if you go to a certain retailer that they will not be permitted to impose a minimum spend when using the card?
So ultimately, Stuart, the issue around the merchant and whether the merchant's willing to take the card is a matter for the merchant.
That's a given. I understand that some people may say we're just not taking cards at all. That's okay. But once they agree to take the card, it's a pound or a penny.
It's a relationship between the card user and the merchant as to whether or not they feel that they want to have a minimum spend on it. And that's something that we cannot influence because, I mean, that is a relationship. You as an individual have your right to decide whether or not you're going to use it in that merchant or not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there control over the charging for merchants in this? I mean, is the card provider or are you dictating or saying? Because as I understand it, depending on just for normal credit and debit cards, there's a wide range of charges. And if you go into a shop, they usually look at you in horror if you want to offer them something, for example, like an American Express card, but they're quite happy to take,
A debit card.
A debit card.
Yes.
Are you dictating, or is the card company dictating what the charge is, and is it at the lowest level available for merchants?
So there is no charge for the merchants in terms of this card. Okay.
None.
We're meeting the cost in a sense.
So in those circumstances, then there really is no excuse for a retailer to impose a minimum charge or a minimum spend when you go into the shop. I think that's a very important message that needs to go out clearly. And to be honest with you, my advice would be, unless it's in the most extreme of circumstances, turn on your heels and walk out.
And we would say the same. In terms of it's a matter really for the individual to make that decision.
Okay. You talked about services, and I welcome the fact that this minister has widened out the range compared to what we were being talked about previously in respect of this process. But can I ask in two particular areas, in relation to, because we're about to hit a very serious crisis in terms of energy prices in the next couple of weeks. You're going to see a massive increase in both gas and electricity prices. Can people use this to pay utility bills like gas and electricity, or make a contribution, because it won't pay anybody's bill?
So it's not envisaged that it'll be used for the payment of bills at all, financial bills. So it's not. However, I mean, there will be
prepayment cards, and people go into a merchant and use those machines for.
And again, there are certain circumstances where that can happen, right? And in those circumstances, if they're not registered as part of the MC list, then we will not be able to pick that up. Okay, right? So in those circumstances, that could happen. It's a very similar situation to, as an example, let's take lotto cards that are sold in some of the big retail outlets, where they go in, and if you use your card, then in those circumstances, it wouldn't show in terms of the spend, in terms of the merchant code that's on the system. And therefore, we can't get in behind that in order to stop that. But at the same time, if you walked into the bookmakers, and tried to lay a bet with it, we can stop it.
Yeah, I understand that. But so you could go into a large supermarket chain and go on one of their self-thingy tills, and you could buy lottery cards.
No, well, you wouldn't be able to buy it online, because you have to buy it. That would be an online service. Yeah. And you wouldn't be able to buy that online. Okay. So that's stopped. Okay.
But I could get them at checkout in a large supermarket.
Well, sure, that is correct. Yeah, because I'm not sure. We're not sure in terms of how they code that. In some places, it might be coded that it will come up as a lottery card. In others, it won't.
Okay. So can we at least get an assurance that the department will communicate with the large, and in reality, it is only the large supermarket retail outlets that provide that service? Yes. Can we make sure that the department, although it's clearly difficult to block technically, that you invite them to do that, or that they put up appropriate in-store signage to advise people with regards to how they could spend their resource? That's very helpful. What about donating the money? In other words, if I wanted to give my money to a charity in Northern Ireland, how could I do that, or could I do that?
So, that's in two different ways. This is not cash for an individual. This is spend to be spent in the local economy. Back to the policy objectives. Mm-hmm. This is spend about stimulating local businesses. Mm-hmm. It's not £100 being given to an individual for them to decide what they want to do with it in terms of their own decision making. So that we're looking for them to spend the money. A donation to charity, in terms of trying to give them the £100, right, would be not within the policy objectives. However, there are other ways by which you can support a local charity. You can buy a good, which you can then give to the local charity, right, in lieu of that.
For example, a food bank. Yeah. So I could go into a supermarket and buy £100 worth of food and bring it to the food bank. You can do that. Food bank.
That's a matter for that's your decision. Yeah. You can go into the charity shop and buy goods in the charity shop, which they're selling, and therefore you're supporting the charity. Mm-hmm. But in terms of actually saying that you want to cash in the £100, or you want to give them all the £100 cards, that's not what the policy intent is, and we're not trying to do that.
And I suppose the wider question is, can I simply just gift my card? Could I give it to a family member or some other person? You
can allow anyone else, if you give the permission, you can allow someone else to spend that card on your behalf. Yes.
So I could actually give the card to a charity to allow them to spend it, for example, to buy supplies, to buy services. I mean, John made reference, for example, to the numbers of nurses and care assistants and people that money can be used to stimulate the economy. If I wanted to give my money to a cancer charity that was going to be able to employ an additional nurse or whatever.
So one of the issues for us as a service is watching the issue around the profile of the spend, okay? Because clearly we also want to avoid the cards being used in a negative sense, whereby they're being, in a sense, collected by organised crime and then being traded into a merchant in order to derive cash, right, in terms of that process. So we'll be watching then how the cards are being used, right, and where merchants then are starting to use the cards in a spend profile, which isn't in line with their normal spend profile, and that will then start to flag up issues. We would not be advising that people should be giving charities their card. We would much prefer if people undertook the other way and gifted products to them, or gifted service that they need. Yes.
Cigarettes and alcohol. Are cigarettes and alcohol permitted?
They are. Yes, you can purchase with them.
I'm particularly concerned about alcohol from the perspective of, setting aside the public health issue around it, much more that it is potentially a coercive activity, that people can be forced to go to a supermarket and buy that and give the alcohol as payment for various activities in communities. It already happens, and it's a difficult one.
It takes you into a realm in terms of making some judgments, and I think that in the balance in the greater scheme of this, hospitality, alcohol is seen as a really important industry in the Northern Ireland, and therefore we want to ensure that that is also being supported through the stimulus scheme.
That bit I get, but buying a bottle of vodka and handing it over to somebody else.
Yes, sure, but at the same time, there are revenues. That's happening at the moment.
It does.
It happens at the moment. That's without the scheme. Yes. And clearly then there's an issue, the wider issue there than simply the £100 card scheme.
Believe me, there are those out there who will see this as an opportunity to effectively put it into what's described, I suppose, as the broad money laundering or money lending systems. To what extent have you had discussions with PSNI about fraud and the implications of things like money laundering, for want of a better word, or loan sharking?
So at the moment we're going through a process whereby we have a team in who are working with us around fraud and error and flagging up the issues around where potential risks are and doing a fraud risk assessment. We will be writing to the PSNI asking for a meeting to discuss the issue around, are they seeing, we will be monitoring the fraud from our perspective, but we will be keen to hear from PSNI whether they're seeing any impact on the streets in respect of the cards.
Yeah, and I understand, obviously, from a technical perspective, you have to be cautious about that, about fraud, about the use of the cards, but I'm thinking more about the community fraud and community criminal activity around the cards, and to what extent the PSNI are engaged in that conversation, and indeed the wider community. I would hope that people would want to be the eyes and the ears of their more vulnerable neighbours.
We will be in contact with PSNI, I can assure you.
And community safety initiatives.
And yes, we're happy to write to them, but again, remember, sure, that this scheme will run for
6 weeks.
6 weeks, 8 weeks. You know, I mean, so the amount of time that we have to do that, we will certainly write out to them on that basis.
Finally, Chair, you made reference to helpline, both for the public. Inevitably, and we've seen this, for example, in relation to all of the COVID issues, will there be an elected representatives helpline as well, so that we can get in there and have issues resolved as quickly as possible?
It's one of the issues that we're looking at in terms of how we do that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair.
Stuart. Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tommy, for that. I suppose a couple of points. First of all, aren't I right in thinking, I know, like, I take on board what's been said, that if money could be spent on the basis of it being like a permanent, recurrent, it's always more helpful. But I think I'm right in saying that the original funding for this it's effectively COVID allocated money, was it originally on that basis, which then puts an imperative effectively to be spent, because otherwise Treasury will simply claim the money back, sort of as a result. And I know, ironically, I think, given that various parties and all of us have been involved in the executive, and quite often then they can play it across different sectors of government is there's not enough money. Actually, the vast splurges of money that come sometimes very late in the day in terms of COVID, sometimes has actually made it incredibly difficult to spend. So I suppose to some extent there's that level of restriction. I'd also welcome, I think, also the references to the benefit side of it, because I know in a few cases that, for instance, the one-off payment to carers had an impact sometimes on benefits, which didn't negate very welcome money to people on it, but meant sometimes they were gaining a certain amount and then losing off housing benefit or other elements on it. So I think that is a useful step forward. And also I think welcome the rebranding. I think all of us will represent constituencies which quite often have one or two main towns in it, but will also have a spread of villages, and sometimes the feeling is that if something is branded the wrong way, the assumption is everybody's going to go to Belfast or they've got to go to the big town, whereas particularly I suppose traders in some of those smaller locations will want to ensure that they get a size of this. And also I suppose then the other thing, just finally to welcome before I deal with a few questions, I thought it was very useful answer you'd given earlier on to Mike Nesbitt in terms of the capacity of the portal, because I think we've seen, I'm not saying necessarily through economy, but we've seen time and again when it's government departments, arm's length bodies, and they set up some form of website, online application process, and quite often overall that works out well, but you get into this massive reputational issue that you then have on day one the thing has crashed or whatever. And I'm conscious of the fact the volume of numbers, because like I would anticipate, while there may well be some people who will get this and never spend it, I would anticipate a very swift interest in this to give you, I suppose, one, and I suppose all of us maybe slightly misunderstood at one stage that in terms of the registration side of it, but I think the day it was possibly the Finance Minister announced more or less you have to be on the new register to be able to get access to the card. My understanding previously, the Electoral Office, their record was about 80,000 applications over 6 weeks, and that within 24 hours of that being said, there was 81,000 people contacted the Electoral Office. So it did have some virtuous benefits. What it does suggest is that actually, for a lot of people, as soon as this is available, they'll be very keen to do that. I suppose then just a few questions. In terms of the issue of timing, you obviously said that because of some of the external disruption and other things, that effectively you're doing a bit of catch-up to be hitting the ground running. And obviously we appreciate that in terms of timing, maximise the spend, but also the timing of the profile of spend is critical, because if it's pushed, for example, if something happened and it ended up being at a later stage, then it would, an awful lot of this would be much more displacement. I presume because there are valid arguments people are making about extension of spend, be it particularly to younger consumers, 16, 17-year-olds. Presumably at this stage, if you were then to actually say, well, actually we're going to have to adjust this system to include others, to change it to that, but I mean, would that lead from a pure practical point of view to maybe impossibility to implement on time if you had to make significant changes to it at this stage?
Brenda can come in as well, but I would think that in summary, Peter, we couldn't do it at this stage.
Yeah.
You want to say something more?
No, I would agree. It's more from the verification for 16 and 17-year-olds. I know that 17-year-olds can be represented in the electoral database, but the numbers are, the percentage is really, really low, and there would be a lot of manual checks, and it would put significant, I suppose, pressure on
presumably, is there an additional issue? I know a lot of this is due to verification, which you get into the trying to navigate through the minefield in terms of data protection. Is there additional concerns over data protection for those who are under 18?
Under 18, yeah. There'll be a whole series of GDPR regulations that we also need to put in place around under 18s.
Just while I'm on verification, obviously you mentioned the, shall we say, the escalator, very, very American here, but the escalator going up in that regard. Yes. I suppose the concern to make sure we don't have some people up on the roof and out through the fire escape who are still sort of unguarded. So you've got, if you like, a system. But beyond that, I know you're saying you're working, for instance, with vulnerable groups. You're talking about the homeless, etc. Are you looking at putting in place some additional sort of final backstop situation? Because a recognition out of the 1.5 million, or whatever the exact figure is, you'll go through the various systems, but you may still end up with a small number.
There will be, yes. And there will be a process then for appeal for that decision. So whenever you go through those various steps and you get to the end and you're notified that we haven't been able to verify you, then there will be an opportunity then for you to appeal that decision, and you will then have an opportunity to submit further evidence which demonstrates that you meet the criteria of being resident in Northern Ireland, whether that be with a bank statement, whether that be utility bill, that sort of issue.
Because I'm conscious it wasn't so much an identification, but I remember from last year, whenever the issue of enabling payments, for instance, of free school meals over summer periods and over holiday periods, that actually there was one that was a very efficient system, because we had on the one central database pretty much the vast majority of people that were receiving uniform grant and that type of thing. But it did then end up that from a processing point of view, there were a few hundred that had to be done different ways because of that. Can I ask in terms of timing, I know what you said earlier on in terms of ministerial direction. I mean, part of the issue, I suppose, in making the exact predictions on this in terms of spend, that's a certain belt and braces part of it. But also in terms of the pure amount of spend, slightly dependent upon behavioural activity, which nobody can ever be 100% certain exactly. And probably the estimate is that we'll get the vast bulk of stuff absorbed. If you ended up, if we take maybe the worst case scenario and there was a considerable underspend, I appreciate to some extent that will then go back to the executive to decide in connection with that. Is there any opportunity, and I appreciate you always want to avoid stuff over Christmas and maybe the first week or two into January or whatever, is there any opportunity for either a reactivation or a second tranche if we ended up, maybe take, maybe say the absurd example with 30% of the money not being spent? Right?
So let's take the point that you made at the very beginning, Peter, in terms of the benefit disregard and the taxation disregard. Both of those are on the premise and clear understanding that this is a one-off scheme. If we were to go to try and reactivate a scheme to run a second tranche of it, then that disregard would fall, and DWP and HMRC would start to review it as a different way.
It's really one bite of the cherry.
So that would bring with it a whole series of other issues for those people who are receiving it.
Okay, maybe just the final point then, just to want to check up. In terms of, obviously we mentioned it before, and I suppose we're trying to balance out, you know, I appreciate what's been said in terms of fraud, although I suppose with regard to some of the things, it's difficult to see sometimes certain things happening in practice on the ground that are really difficult directly to stop, at least by ourselves, and maybe the PSNI may have some other actions that they can take in connection with that. But I suppose on the flip side of the coin, you mentioned obviously there will be under certain conditions people are able to get the permission to apply, particularly say for a family member or whatever. What's the process, or is there a strict process in terms of the spend? Because we'll get obviously a number of occasions where it's a relative who is either in a home or they are effectively sort of housebound, or they're through a disability, or I mean I was starting to remind a number of days ago being outside a house where there was a sign basically saying, you know, we are very vulnerable, our immune system are vulnerable, basically we're not coming out of the house, we're not answering the door. So, you know, that family may have a member of the family that could go out for them, but, you know, there will need to be those sort of proxy measures. Could you just talk us through where we are just with what's the sort of ease of permissibility for that to be able to, notwithstanding we want to ensure there isn't fraud, but to ensure then that people can, and take on board obviously the point is try to stimulate the economy rather than necessarily benefit the individuals, but so that in those circumstances that there isn't too much of a barrier put in place to enable that spend for the, you know, an elderly parent or a housebound member of the family or whatever type of thing.
So one of the provisions that we are allowing, whilst we talk about online, that people will not be able to shop online, they will be able to shop on click and collect. So they will be able to ring their local merchant, their local butcher, their local grocer. They will be able to order their food or whatever they want to purchase off that, pay for it over the phone and get it delivered. Okay, so they may not be able to leave the house, but they can get goods delivered to them, and that way then they can use their £100 to buy things for themselves. Okay, so that provision will be there.
What about then circumstances where it is, for instance, say either a carer or a next relative? Because I'm also conscious you mentioned about say somebody who is say clinically vulnerable can phone up saying I'm clicking and collecting. That's fair enough, isn't it? But if this is meant for every adult, we will have, for example, those who are either staying in a nursing home or, for instance, somebody with personally either has a disability that would mean that they couldn't interact on that basis, or if you take, say, somebody with dementia, for instance, on that basis, they're not in a position to click and collect, I would have thought. So they would be relying on a partner, a family member, or whoever. What's the position?
I think we also need to be clear that we're not trying to create a new system around this. Those people who are in nursing homes, those people who've got conditions where they've got carers, a lot of those people are already covered by existing arrangements whereby there are responsibilities to ensure that those individuals, both in terms of their personal care and also their financial care, already have got protection arrangements built around them. So if I'm in a nursing home and I'm under the care of the homeowners have a clear duty of care to protect the individual and protect whatever valuables they have. And this just fits into that arrangement. So we're not trying to install new systems, we're trying to ensure that what people understand their responsibilities be, it'll apply to this card as well.
And that will be clear to people, because again, if there's somebody like who's say on attendance allowance,
people are getting paid their benefits at the moment. People have cards at that moment. People have cash. There's a lot of, and all of those arrangements are being dealt with, and the sector is very, very good. There's lots of well-established procedures for the dealing of that. And so if someone applies for this card and it comes to their nursing home or their residential home, it'll just fit into that same environment.
And similarly, I think whenever you mentioned earlier about people could, under the circumstances, be given permission to apply for someone, would that also cover them for permission to spend, or is that?
That could cover them to permission to spend, yes.
It seems to be that if there's a one-step process that gets over both.
Oh, there's a one-step
process. I'm conscious that some people may miss out as a result of that. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Peter. And so can I just return to the 16 to 17-year-olds issue, because it would be useful to have set out the reasons in relation to the data, the GDPR concerns that there would be there, because, for example, you'll have a lot of 17-year-olds who may have a provisional licence, so that's a database that they will be on. There may be some who would be accessing benefits, so would be on databases. There's school registration that could potentially be used, or college registration. So, in terms of verifying the data, there are databases where these young people will be on. And I don't think, it's not a huge number. I think, what are we talking, maybe max 50,000 additional?
About 46,000, yeah.
Pardon?
46,000 between the two groups, yeah.
It would maybe just be useful for us to have that set out.
I think that'd be fair, Sarah, we'll do that. Okay, once that's completed, once we've finalised that policy position, we're happy to write to the committee on that basis and set that argument out. Okay.
Claire, can we bring Claire into the spotlight, please? Can you hear us okay, Claire?
Yeah, sorry, Chair, I wasn't able to unmute myself there. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone. I kind of want to pick up on the points that the Chair is making around the 16 and 17-year-olds as well. It doesn't, I don't really understand the GDPR issues in relation to that, and I would concur with some of the suggestions that the Chair has made in and around that. So I appreciate that this is not a fully developed policy position yet, and you're still looking at that and you're still getting the legal advice, but I do think it would be useful for this committee to get a full understanding as to why this can't be extended to 16, 17-year-olds. And earlier as well, you said it's because they're not adults legally. That doesn't really give me a response either, if I'm honest, because 16, 17-year-olds can work. They have a national insurance number, they can spend. So, I would be very supportive of extending it to 16, 17-year-olds. But I think if the department is going to try and justify not extending it to that, I think we need valid reasons in relation to that. So, I would be keen, to hear what it is. I think the intent around it as well, it's not necessarily, as you say, about providing additional income for people, and I accept that. However, if this is about encouraging people to shop on the high street, who better than that age cohort who would tend to, I would imagine, shop online anyway. So perhaps you're trying to reintroduce them to something that does, they need to be stimulated to recognising that they can spend on the high street. So, I think the policy intent that has clearly been outlined by the Minister and indeed her or his predecessor, is very much one of a stimulus, but I think you would very much realise your policy position if you had extended that to the 16 and 17-year-olds. I'll ask just a number of questions, and if, maybe all at once, and if you can pick up on that. You perhaps have already answered it in relation to registration. I've had a few queries in relation to people who are unable to get onto the electoral register because they wouldn't be a full UK citizen at this point. However, they're still awaiting that. So how will they be able to access that? Will they be able to verify it through other means, such as the driving licence? Maybe, as you had said, they are able to work here, but for some reason they can't get onto those systems. One of the other things that you had talked about in the past as well was about trying to maximise the value of the £100, and it was about trying to encourage maybe more of the smaller independent businesses to, I suppose, offer better value for money. And that seemed to be quite a big drive by the department to do that, but I'm not sure I've heard much since in relation to that. So what support are you offering to small businesses to be able to maximise that and maybe inspire them to offer better value for money, so that people are more likely to go and shop in more independent shops rather than the bigger companies? And in terms of your last point around click and collect, I think you need to be really careful around the language there, because click and collect for me is shopping online. I appreciate people can phone up and then perhaps get that delivered, but if we look at the experience of the pandemic this past year, people were clicking, literally going onto the computer and shopping online and then picking it up at their stores. So I think we need to be a wee bit more clear around the messaging in relation to that. Otherwise, people maybe won't fully utilise this scheme in the time that's required of them. So, thank you.
Okay. So, Claire, can I just pick up, because just the sound here, in terms of the first one, is really relating to people who are awaiting their national insurance number. Is that correct?
No, it was really just to reiterate the chair's point that 16, 17-year-olds would have a national insurance number. They're able to earn, they're able to spend. I don't really understand the department's rationale for not extending it. And the chair had suggested that it was a specific number, so we know what the additional budget will be required in relation to that. So I suppose what I'm saying is I, as a member of the committee and as a representative of this group of people, would be keen to really fully understand the rationale as to why the department isn't extending it to 16, 17-year-olds, because any of the reasons given at this point don't make sense to me, and certainly could be debated quite easily, in my opinion. So certainly if you don't have that information to hand, I think the committee would be interested to really understand what the GDPR issues are and other things that you've already suggested.
Okay. So I've well said, we've given a commitment that we will come back to the committee with a clear statement of the policy on the 16 to 17 once we've finalised that with our Minister, setting that out for the committee. Okay. In terms of the issues around the question around maximising it for local businesses, and we have been talking to a number of the regional organisations in terms of how we should go forward in terms of publicising it. We have arrangements agreed in principle that we're going to have a webinar for a lot of the Chamber of Commerce, and the Minister, whenever he's been out, has been talking to local chambers around the types of initiatives that they want to take forward, in particular trying to move some of the spend away from the Saturdays and get people into the shops during the week, how they're going to offer discounts. Those sort of promotional ideas are all there, and we are going to promote that as well, and whenever we get the communications, so that they will have access to the sort of supporting materials that they need. So that works on hand. Okay. And we take the point around the click and collect. We were just responding specifically to people the question around people who couldn't leave their homes. But I take the point as well that we don't want to maintain that service. We do want to try and get people back into the shops again. Yes.
And another point, maybe you didn't hear me earlier, was in relation to those who are unable to get onto the electoral register for various reasons. I have a constituent recently whose partner, who's originally from the United States, but unable to get onto the electoral register, but has lived here for a while, and to me should be, the scheme should be as accessible to them as anyone else. Are there alternative ways of verifying their eligibility for the scheme?
So we'll talk through. Do you want to say, Brenda?
Well, in terms of the verification, I mean, obviously being on the electoral register is not part of the eligibility criteria. It's just used for verification. So if they are living in Northern Ireland, and they will be eligible for the card if they don't have the driving licence. If they're living here and they're able to work here, they will have been given a national insurance number, and that will be used as the third verification check. And in terms of those who don't have national insurance numbers, for example, asylum seekers, etc., we are liaising with representatives from those bodies to try to see how we can facilitate their application.
And I'm assuming, you've already answered this, that there will be some form of application process or portal, for those people to access if they're not being picked up by the more standard sorts of things like the electoral register or driving licence.
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Sorry, I beg your pardon, it's not a great line. I'm assuming that there will be some sort of access point for them, if they're not being picked up in any other ways. So I'm assuming they will have to apply for it in the same way as everyone else.
Yeah, well, for anybody that has a national insurance number, they will be able to apply via the portal. That will be their unique identifier, and they should be picked up through the verification process. For those that don't, we are looking at a separate process for those smaller sort of I suppose groups, and looking at a way that they'll be able to access the card in the scheme.
Okay, thank you.
You mentioned, Tommy, the appeal process.
Yes.
At what point will that kick in? So will those people have to wait till mid-October before that, or will it be a case of once they're rejected they can appeal?
Yeah, once they're rejected, then they will have under the regulations, they'll have a number of days in which to appeal. They don't have to wait until the portal closes or anything like that. They can do that as soon as they're notified.
Okay, thank you. Can we bring Sinead into the spotlight, please?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Tommy and Brendan team, for your briefing this morning. And I suppose my colleagues have raised quite a bit of issues in relation to verification, eligibility, criteria and all of that, and I would align myself with comments of the Chair in relation to 16, 17-year-olds and agree totally with Claire and the observations that she has made as well. I suppose it's all down to, the policy intent in and around the High Street Voucher Scheme, and I suppose I've been on the record in many times at committee in regard to the policy intent. I suppose when we're spending public money in such large amounts on one scheme, and Stuart raised the issue of the terminology of this being the cornerstone of the economic recovery plan of the department. I have real concerns that this type of scheme would be the cornerstone when we see so many other areas within the economy that are in dire need of support, and just I question the long-term economic impact that this scheme is going to have. Without a doubt, without a shadow of a doubt, shops and high streets and retailers will definitely get a real boost from this scheme. But, will it have a lasting economic impact? Will it have a lasting impact on behaviour of our citizens in relation to spending? I'm not too sure, and I have yet to see any evidence about that. And just based on the economic benefits and the multiplier effect, I still haven't got any data from the department about what the economic multiplier is. We're pushing out a scheme that, and I agree with Tommy in what he says, it's not the department's role to dictate where individuals spend these vouchers, but this scheme is entirely dependent on where individuals spend this money. The success of this scheme is entirely dependent on how people spend this money. So, the department's not in control of that, yet they have made this scheme the entire cornerstone of their economic recovery plan from COVID. I mean, to me, that's a very volatile way to deliver a programme where you have no control of it. and yet we are where we are. And I suppose what we really need to concentrate on is that the process and the delivery of the scheme is smooth, and that those that have a right to access it can access it, and that those that may want to disrupt the scheme in using it for fraudulent means, or setting up maybe crime schemes in and around it, that we drive and protect that down. And that's where I think that we really need to ensure that it doesn't run away from us in any shape, form or fashion. So like I really want to make sure that you have in the department, that you have all the resources that you need in order to ensure that the money gets to the people that we intend it to get to, and doesn't get into the hands of crime lords within our communities. And I just want to know what more you have done around pushing down the fraud aspect of it.
So Sinead, thank you very much. So in terms of where we are at the moment, we are currently carrying out a major fraud risk assessment being carried out by PwC with their financial expert teams in terms of the systems controls, the eligibility criteria, and then the controls that exist within PFS, who are the pre-card provider. Okay, and we're trying to look at the whole holistic end-to-end system about all of the fraud controls from the portal end right through the verification processes, the transfer of the data, and then the issuing of the card and the spend. So we're reviewing all of that end-to-end process, and they're coming in and looking at the system of controls which exist, and are making a series of recommendations about how to ensure that we protect the system. So we're also involving the National Cyber Security Team in reviewing the system in its entirety to give us some recommendations in terms of what other controls we should put in place. So let me give you one example of that we've put in place. At the moment, in terms of you go onto the portal, right, and if you were going on to, let's say, on to do your put your information in, we're having to introduce a control at the front of that to protect it against an algorithm attack into the portal, which would then go after different house addresses and national insurances. So we're trying to create that unique identifier arrangement in order to protect it. So there's an active programme taking place at the moment, Sinead, to try and ensure that the system as it's being built, that we're also putting around it walls to protect it in terms of attack from outside, whether that be organised crime or some other source.
Thank you. And Tommy, I spoke to you last week when the Chair and I met with you in relation to the timing of the rollout. I'm concerned about that as well. We had spoken to economists, and one of the areas that they concentrated their responses to us was in ensuring that if the scheme was utilised, that it was very important to choose your timing right in order for it to have a maximum impact. And it was never envisaged that that would be running to the end of November at all, because that is the Christmas period. Absolutely the Christmas period. November is the big spend period, and yet the scheme is running at exactly the time that we have been advised not to run it. So I have serious concerns around that, but individuals receiving their £100 will be very, very much welcoming it, and they will need it because we have a tough winter coming. Energy prices are going sky high, and we'll be hearing big announcements about that next week. And disposable income will be very much in short supply. It'll be about food on the table and fuel poverty and child poverty that will be concentrating our minds on within the economy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tommy, can I just ask a question around the end of November cut-off? Because you mentioned previously that the Jersey scheme saw a lot of people use it very quickly in the first couple of weeks. But is there a risk just running it into that Black Friday period that people might save it to that point and you could have a big demand at that particular period, and potentially that could be a difficulty.
Chair, there are always risks around this. I mean, what we will do is we'll be communicating from the start of this launch that people should be spending the money in their local shops and their local businesses. We're not looking at the 30th of November. I mean, the 30th of November stop date for us is really, in some ways, is also to allow for the scheme to run through, because we will not be able to put out 1.5 million cards, in one go. We need a number of weeks to do that, and to give people a decent period in which to spend it. It pushes that towards that date. Right? So, it's just trying to ensure that the scheme rolls as smoothly as possible and has the maximum impact. There is always an issue about if some people hold on to the end, but we don't really envisage that will be the case. I think people, and the evidence shows that people will spend it in the first number of weekends, and that's where we think it'll happen.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of the communications plan.
Part of the communications plan.
The research paper, there was talk about looking at things like midweek spend and promotion around midweek spend. Is that something that's
the work we're going to be doing with the Chamber of Commerce and others in terms of the particular sectors? That once we've confirmed within the dates that we're going to roll it out, they'll be looking to take that information and then really start to promote it in their local communities. They don't want to do it too soon. I think they want to do it closer to the time of the rollout.
Stephen?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, folks, for your presentation and very detailed update. Certainly there's been a lot of welcome progress from our meeting in early July, and we all certainly recognise that and commend it. And I think there is certainly a real appetite and enthusiasm for the rollout of these cards, particularly amongst the business community and the general public. And I think perhaps there's a better appetite outside of this building than perhaps there is around the committee today. And I know certainly many people are looking forward to getting these rolled out. I think the spend local message, which already has been mentioned, there's merit in that, and that that many of our local businesses are located beyond our high streets, within retail, hospitality and services, etc. Just a couple of points. Obviously there's been a lot of information which has been discussed already this morning, so I don't intend to repeat that, but there was a number of Q&As, I suppose, which appeared online over the last few weeks, and to me they did appear rather complex. And I think it is important that we keep this straightforward as possible for the applicants, and I think that's where the clear communications will be essential. I know you've touched upon the communication plan that you have, and obviously the helpline facility is particularly welcome. Again, what you've covered, those that don't have online facilities. For example, some people have said to me, can their card only be used within their own town centre, where they live? I think those are the sort of messages that it'll be good to hammer home in terms of the communications. And then, when I say no, it can be used anywhere in Northern Ireland, that they find that certainly they didn't know that. So those are the sort of things that I think need to be taken on board. And I think the point has been made about some people were questioning that it's just a short-term scheme and some of the terminology around the priority for the department. But I certainly have every confidence that when people get back out into our town centres, those who maybe haven't been shopping, have got out of the way of it, haven't been eating out as much, I think when they see the quality of products and their the high quality hospitality sector, I have every confidence that this card will see long-term benefits in terms of increased footfall right across our local economy. Just a couple of questions. Is there a facility for people to see their balance online? Can they log into a portal, obviously after they've used it, or they may leave it for a few weeks? Can they check that? Just a couple other questions, and perhaps you'll answer them just at the end, if that's okay. Is the name, and I presume everybody's name is printed on the card, the same as a debit card, and then will ID be required, obviously, to match up with that name for use? Another question was mentioned just in terms of is there a limit how many cards can be used per one transaction? So say somebody was buying a £500 TV, for example, and if they had a family of 4, can they use 4 cards together to get a good bargain on that TV? And then just final point then, obviously the separate holiday at home scheme will be coming through from the department. I think it would be important just to, obviously there has been some confusion even raised with myself on that, in terms of will there be overlap with that, and obviously that will separate. I presume that'll be that be maybe spring 22, you might be looking at that. So just a couple of points, and thanks for the update. Thank you. Thanks.
So in terms of the balance, so there will be a facility by which you can check your balance, either online or through the IVR system. Okay. In terms of your name, the name will be printed on the card, similar to what you have on your debit card.
Yeah.
So it will be in that approach. So it will.
And does that need, do you need ID then to match up with that name?
No.
No.
I mean, you'll just, because the card, it's £100, so you'll be able to use it in the sense of swipe the way you do at the moment.
Yeah.
Right? You'll have your PIN, okay, that you can use then insert it into the merchant's terminal and just use your PIN. So whenever you verify by IVR, it'll tell you what your password is.
I mean, what's AVR?
You asked me a question.
That's true, if you don't know, that's okay.
It's IVR.
Interactive voice recording.
Okay.
I think it is, something like that. So whenever you ring up, and it'll just tell you the message. It'll send you your PIN, tell you what your PIN is.
Yeah.
If you verify your card by SMS, it'll send you an SMS message, right, in terms of telling you what your PIN is. Okay, and you'll be able to use it on that basis in terms of inserting your card.
Yeah.
But once you get the £100, or once you get to your balance, it won't go any over that. Okay. In terms of your family, we have a member of the project who talks about that he will have there will be 5 in his family who will all have the card. And if they want to go and buy a washing machine or they want to go and buy a fridge and they want to bring their cards, it's a matter for you and the merchant. It really is. You'll be able to use it collectively as a group,
So
and that'll be fine.
It can't be used for one transaction.
It can't be used for one transaction.
Right, okay.
And you'll be able to top it up if you go into a merchant and you want to buy something at £150 and you have £100 in your card.
Yeah.
If subject to the merchant, you can put £50 on top of it
Yeah.
and pay for that as well. Okay? And the last one was around,
I just did holiday at home scheme.
well, at the moment it's not running, so we're
Yeah.
expecting it'll be New Year.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll be finished by that time.
Yeah. Just in terms of the communications, obviously, from experience, I suppose, I think the helpline, I can't emphasise how vital that will be in terms of the phone call. Yes, it's a digital scheme, but I think we do have to respect that, for various reasons, there is, a large percentage and a group of people that simply
No,
cannot
yeah.
and will not be able to, so I think that there needs to be, and there's no, people don't want to be ringing up and saying, you're waiting 10, 12, 15 minutes in your queue. I think it's vital that the resources are there.
Taking us back to the question around encouraging people to use the digital line, use the digital portal,
Well, accept
so that scheme is only for the telephone service is only for those who need it.
Yeah, but I think there will be big demand on that phone service, in terms of, we see it in welfare and all sorts of things, that, the phone call thing is vital, and I think it's vital that departments have those resources in place to deal with that.
So we are working with our minister around how we address that issue.
Yeah, okay, thank you, folks.
Stuart, we were looking back in.
Yeah, Chair, just very, very briefly, it's around the issue of the lower age limit that we've talked about, 16 and 17-year-olds. Now, we've already had one delay in the delivery of the scheme due to a legal intervention. Is it likely that a further legal intervention, for example, an equality or other claim against the scheme in relation to age, would delay the scheme?
Stuart, I couldn't answer that question since I'm not legally qualified. But I mean, clearly in terms of the advice which we're giving our minister, we are taking legal advice as part of that process, and that will form part of the advice we're giving her.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
And just to pick up on that point, is there an equality screening of the scheme was undertaken?
It has, yes. I mean, Chair, as you would expect, the department's complying with all of its statutory requirements, and the quality scheme has been carried out, yes, and that will be published in due course.
And just finally, from myself, a couple of questions that people have just asked on social media. Things like dentists will be able to be used in that, because that would be considered retail, so you could go in and pay for your dental treatment.
Yes, service.
And social enterprises, same thing. They're businesses, so used in.
If they have a merchant's machine, then they can use it there. Yes.
And I suppose for us, it might be useful to see the system, the application system, or even like screenshots of it or something, if that would maybe be.
Yeah, we're actually.
I think. Arranged.
Yeah, we'll try and arrange that to get just some views of that, screenshots of it as soon as possible. Okay.
Great.
Just to have the testing team in at the moment, and they're just going through that process. But as soon as that's completed, certainly get that for the committee.
And you mentioned just when you were talking to Mike about potentially 50,000 people concurrently would be able to apply. Will there be a queuing system? So, for example, at the minute when you're applying for an MOT, you have to, if there's too many people applying at one time, there's a queue and it tells you how long you're going to be there. Is there something like that, or?
Chair, I can't answer the question. I mean, at the moment, so the team at the moment are just building up the load in the sense of working through that. I haven't had a chance to talk to the app developer, see how they're going to deal with the queue. So they are, but I mean, hopefully, we do some messaging whereby we try and phase it a wee bit. We may know people will be very keen, but we don't really want 500,000 people applying on the first day of the scheme. We'd like to try and phase it if we could. I know we won't be able to stop them, but all we can do is do our best. Okay.
Well, look, thanks very much. It has been really enlightening. So, any other questions, I'm sure that we get through, we'll send through to you as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, members. So, is there things that we want to pick up? Yep. Okay, so if members were content that we would, following today's briefing, write to the Minister expressing our view that we believe 16 and 17-year-olds should be included in the scheme, and around the aims and objectives of the scheme as to why that we think that should happen.
Chair, just on that, I think in terms of 16 and 17-year-olds, may well be the overall view of the committee. I would have grave concerns that if we introduce a variation into the scheme at this stage, it will knock this out. It will knock it and delay it into a further bit, and I think time is of the essence. So I would have, if you want to say it's the majority view of the overall position of the committee, but I'm conscious. I think it's useful if we can get down. I think the offer that was made that they would set out, if you like, the rationale on as opposed to just answering the questions on it, rationale on paper, I think would be useful in that regard. I'm just conscious, I think, that if we seek if there's the expressive view that needs to be some level of variation in this scheme, it won't hit the ground running when it's supposed to. And I take on board, actually, from a processing point of view, we're running things very much to the wire as it is with the November deadline. If we have a situation that gets knocked back a week or two, then I think we're in bigger difficulties.
What if we said we support the principle of 16 to 18s having access to a scheme, but we do not want this scheme to be delayed, so we would like the 16 to 17s included, even if it's a separate scheme post-Christmas?
Content with that?
For consideration of it, yeah, if there's consideration of another scheme.
I think there's obviously the budget aspect with it as well, and obviously, as Peter has mentioned, the avoiding tapping into this Christmas spend period. I think the research shows that they want to maximise the effectiveness of the current scheme, and I think, given the concerns in the July meeting, I think it is good to see the more advanced stage that we're at, and I think we do need to be mindful of getting it moving. So,
Chair, it might be worth also stressing the members can see in the SL1 there's quite a significant amount of thinking around the culture idea of getting people offline. And I think as some members have picked up on, 16 and 17-year-olds live so much online.
There's an opportunity to get them.
It is an opportunity to do that. So it is in keeping with the policy objective. And as Mr. Nesbitt had said, even if it's subsequent, I think from what members are saying, you'd be content for a letter saying, look, 16 and 17-year-olds are really worth thinking about having a scheme. If it's a cultural issue, that's taking people offline, getting them back into stores. Not necessarily this time round. The committee doesn't want to disrupt timescale delivery.
Yeah, I take on board. I think Mike phrased it fairly well. But I was just going to suggest we talk about in any future consideration of another scheme. I mean, the other thing which may be possibilities, again, just depending upon where we land on this, because this is one-off COVID money. Sometimes there'll be a situation that, if any of us got the crystal ball to know what's going to happen over the next 6 months with COVID, unfortunately, that would be a great asset to have. But I'm kind of conscious of what may well be the case, and certainly was found last year by the executive, is sometimes we may get a situation in January where Treasury announces, here's an extra 50, 100 million pounds we're going to make by barring consequentials of COVID money suddenly available to the executive, which needs spent very quickly. So, I take on board what they've said is, here's a one-off scheme, it can only happen for these reasons. Maybe there's something that may or may not be able to be tailored directly at some stage later on after Christmas. So I think we want to keep the door open to it, but I don't think we want to be trying to commit them when money isn't available in that. So I mean, if it was maybe that we see the merit of it in consideration of if there's consideration of a further scheme or something of that nature.
There was a suggestion that if the scheme wasn't fully taken up this side of in this round, that there was the potential. Earlier this year they indicated there was a potential for a mop-up round after Christmas.
I think that what they were saying today was that because of the benefit disregard, that it wouldn't be possible to do a follow-up scheme
But presumably that would be, I understand that in terms of a second scheme,
yeah.
But what we're really saying is if you didn't get in the first round, then if there was a second round which invited people to come forward, and is it possible to add to it? I think we have to be very conscious of the fact, and members around this table will know, that particularly those young people at FE College that missed out on the payments there. I mean, this is a really difficult territory for us, and I really think we should be pulling out the stops to ensure that something is done to cover that group of young people.
Yeah, and I think it's not a case of us asking for it to be in any way delayed to allow for amendments to be made. It's to allow any potential mechanism that can include those young people to be facilitated. So I would expect that if there are reasons why it can't happen, that the Minister would lay those out in response to us, not a case of us asking for the scheme to be delayed.
Yep.
Could we also have a copy of the equality screening exercise that should have been carried out by now? And that may answer some of the questions the way young people were ruled out.
Chair, sorry, can I come in?
Yep. Here, go ahead, Sinead.
Oh, yeah. I would agree with much of the sentiments that have been shared here. Also, just back to the policy objectives, the actual objective is to get footfall increased within our town and city centres, and our young people are certainly key to that, and it's driving their behavioural changes as well. So I would like to see how what assessments were made to exclude them, and what basis that was done. It would be just interesting to see, because I just can't find any reason that 16 plus would not be included.
Okay, so I think we have kind of thrashed out what we want to put into a letter, and Peter will take that away.
We'll craft that this afternoon, Chair.
Is there anything else that people want to suggest coming out of that briefing?
Chair as well. Can I say I'm really concerned about some of the areas about click and collect as well. Click and collect is online. So there'll have to be really quite significant guidelines in and around that. If purchases are being pushed to the high street and to our towns and villages, but yet this big area of online shopping, which is click and collect, is allowed. I'm not sure that that's the intent and the purpose and the overall policy that we were trying to achieve here with this scheme. So I think we need to question that as well. I mean, lotto tickets, I'm afraid, and I was off camera, but if you had seen me, my mouth was dropped when you could buy lotto tickets and things like that on public money. Like, it's unbelievable, but,
Chair, Tommy did mention about the click and collect that it would have to be over the phone. The interesting thing with that is that will only be more likely to be available from a local retailer. You wouldn't be able to do that for click and collect with any of the big multiples. They don't do a phone line.
No.
So what that will mean is, say for example, one of your local restaurants has started doing delivery of veg and stuff like that from their own supply order. You generally have to phone up and say, I want that box or whatever. So you'll still be able to do that and click and collect it, and they would then also probably be able to deliver that. But Tommy did say it would have to be click and collect using a phone method rather than being able to do it online.
I think, Chair, to take Sinead's point, but also the point there, I think what we're really looking, I suppose, is to get the department to flesh out at least what they mean by that. Because, I mean, the flip side of the coin is also, again, to sort of flesh out a bit what methodology they're using for those who, for whatever reason, physical difficulties in participating, and be it the disabled, be it the housebound or whatever, which ties in with, we want to have a situation that doesn't effectively divert it into a form of online, but on the flip side of the coin, we don't want to create a situation where those who may be actually the most vulnerable in our society are effectively prevented from using it because of circumstances as well. But it does strike me, I think the critical bit is, what are they putting in place? What are the fleshed out details? I think we need just to kind of build that sort of muscle around that type of thing.
I think that's an important point. It's about facilitating those people who may not actually be able to go to the shop to benefit from this scheme. But I agree it would be useful to see the detail of how that's actually going to operate and what's the safeguards around it.
Chair, can I?
Go ahead, Claire.
I think my kind of understanding of this is that payments for any good or service will have to be processed by the supplier, which is why then they're able to process it over the phone. So I suppose even you could extend that and understand, well, what other types of payments could the supplier or the merchant process. I suppose that could be really anything. That could be the likes of insurance, car insurance, and all of those types of things. I do think maybe it's just because they don't have any other mechanism to ensure that people can't do that. But I think we are moving away a wee bit from the intent of the scheme, which is about bringing people into town centres or village centres. Hopefully then they're utilising other things whilst they're there, which is, part of the stimulus scheme as much as it is about, the income in and around it. Maybe it just is what it is in respect of that people can't use it online because that means the customer's processing the payment, but if the merchant's doing it, then they can do it via, the telephone. I suppose it just opens up a lot of interest around it and, the intent of the scheme, and I would imagine in most cases it probably won't be an issue, but it's one for reflection anyway.
Chair, it might just be worth picking up on that. Tommy had talked about the merchant codes, that there are over 350 merchant codes in total. Only around 300 will be eligible for use. So, for example, if you rang to try and put a bet on with your card, it won't circumvent the prohibition on that, because the merchant's terminal is linked to a gambling code. So it won't process your card. So it will still prevent that usage even if you use the telephone, because the card is, say for example, you phone up and you give your 16-digit card number to a retailer, that automatically tells them the bank, the type of card, the Visa, the whatever. So it will automatically know that this is a limited card and it won't be processable through their terminal because they are under a code that is prohibited, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it still allows you to keep that prohibition even if you're dealing with people over the phone, because it's the classification of the terminal that the card's being processed through. That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, it does.
The schedule in the SR, I think they said we'll list it, so you'll be expecting that full list there so we can see in more detail what exactly it is excluding. That'll be interesting to see.
Okay, Peter.
Is there? Members can decide if they want to go ahead with it, but we can reserve judgment and say we're not.
Okay, so members have the SL1. If we want to hold on till we see that schedule and the detail around it.
Chair, there are options here. The SL1 is the notifier and has that caveat on it that it's the point to indicate any issues around the policy. What I would suggest is that the letter asking the questions and making suggestions is effectively the committee's response. So rather than approving the SL1 or approving the policy direction, what the committee doesn't have to do, that letter is in lieu of that approval. It sets out the issues that the committee has, and we'll expect a response on those prior to the SR arriving. if the Minister is willing to make changes or whatever, or accede to some of those requests, then the SR may well change as a result. If not, it'll be as it is, and we can pick that up. But it would be in lieu of an approval.
Okay, so members content with that?
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, so look, we're going to move on to deal with our SRs and then come back to our matters arising if members are happy enough. So we'll go to item number 6, and it's SR 2021-202, the Further Education Student Support Amendment, etc. EU Exit Regulations Northern Ireland 2021. There's a clerk's memo at page 578 of your pack, and then just the SR itself is at page 580. These amendments mean that eligibility for home tuition fee charges and student financial support for courses in the North starting in the academic year 2021-22 will be removed for EU, other EEA and Swiss nationals, with the following exception: EU, other EEA and Swiss nationals and family members in the UK at the end of the implementation period on the 31st of December 2020, who are therefore covered by the citizens' rights provisions of the EU Withdrawal Agreement, EEA, EFTA Separation Agreement and Swiss Citizens' Rights Agreement, the withdrawal agreements, and therefore have protected rights, and the status quo will continue for students in the South under common travel area arrangements. These amendments also make changes to the residency categories to clarify some policy aspects, add 3 new residency categories and remove the 3-year ordinary residency requirement for certain residency categories. So this statutory rule is subject to the negative resolution procedure. Members have already considered the SL1, and members will recall that we dealt with the higher education regulations, and at that point in time we sought some clarifications from the department around why the changes were being made. So the rule will come into operation on the 1st, it came into operation on the 1st of August. The Examiner of Statutory Rules has not yet reported on the rule, so members will be agreeing to the legislation subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report. So are members content with the SR? And we'll put the question that the Committee for the Economy has considered the SR 2021/202, the Further Education Student Support Amendment, etc. EU Exit Regulations Northern Ireland 2021, and has no objection to the rule subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report.
Members content?
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So moving on then to item number 7, SR 2021-210, the Industrial Training Levy Construction Industry Order Northern Ireland 2021. There's a clerk's memo at page 608 and the SR is at page 610. This statutory rule enables CITB-NI, formerly known as the Construction Industry Training Board, to fulfil its role and raise funding through a levy on employers in the industry. The purpose of the board, as set in legislation, is to encourage the adequate training of those employed or intending to be employed in the construction industry in Northern Ireland. It has a strategic vision of establishing a training culture throughout the construction industry. It's funded through a statutory levy, which is determined by a percentage of the payroll costs of employers in the construction industry. The levy is to be imposed in respect of the period commencing the 1st of September 2021 and ending on the 31st of August 2022. The levy rate of 0.55% in respect of relevant earnings remains the same rate operating during the preceding levy period, which expires on the 31st of August 2021. See Industrial Training Levy Construction Industry Order Northern Ireland 2020 SR 2020 number 136. An employer will be exempt from levy where the relevant earnings are less than £80,000, which is the same threshold applied in the preceding levy period. So this statutory rule is subject to the negative resolution procedure, and again, members already considered the SL1. The rule came into operation on the 31st of August 2021. The Examiner of Statutory Rules has not reported in this rule, so members will be agreeing to legislation subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report. So members are content, will put the question, which is the Committee for the Economy has considered the SR 2021/210, the Industrial Training Levy Construction Industry Order Northern Ireland 2021, and has no objection to the rules subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on then to item number 8, As in SL1, the education student fees, amounts, loan repayment and support, etc. Amendment Regulations NI 2021. There's a clerk's memo at page 621, and then the SL itself is at page 622. This statutory rule will provide for the annual increases using the inflationary forecast of 2.3% for academic year 2022-23, provided by Treasury to the prescribed basic and higher amounts which higher education institutions here may charge to students who are ordinarily resident in the North and accepted others. The Department has now provided a response to members' queries arising from the committee meeting held on the 30th of June. This response is at page 165 and agenda item 517. And maybe if I just go over those, Peter, for people, because we haven't covered them in the matters arising. So if members want to have a look at 517 at page 165 of your pack, is the committee's query under the education student fees amount. And we asked, would it apply to part-time students? Sorry, I'll go back just to 5.17.
Will apply. Sorry, it should say will not apply because say will not apply because the chair fees for this is an interesting thing. The charges for part-time courses are not regulated under this regime, so it means that there is no, if you like, no governance of that. Obviously, there are accounting governances in place and so on, but the part-time fees are not regulated as full-time fees are, so that's why they don't apply within this.
Can we ask what the historical reason for that is, or what the policy reason for that is?
It was unusual that is an aspect of charging that's not regulated, so absolutely we'll follow up on that and ask what the historical background is.
Okay, so do members want to... Well, this is only the SL1, so...
Sure, we can hold off.
Yeah. Okay, so are members content that we wait on a response in relation to that? Okay. So moving on then to item number 9 is SL1, the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020 Coronavirus Amendment of Relevant Period in Schedule 8, Number 2, Regulations Northern Ireland 2021. There's a clerk's memo at page 628, and then the SL1 is at page 629. This statutory rule is to extend the relevant period during which Schedule 8 to the SIG Act will apply until the 30th of March 2022. Schedule 8 makes temporary provision with respect to company moratoriums. The Department advises that to ensure that companies in the North that are in financial difficulty as a result of coronavirus or otherwise continue to be able to access moratoriums during this time, it is essential that the set of temporary rules in Schedule 8 is kept alive, and the only way to do this is to extend the relevant period during which Schedule 8 is to apply. Members will be familiar with this, as we've already dealt with it a couple of times. So the rule is subject to confirmatory resolution procedure. It's anticipated that the rule will come into operation on the 30th of September, and this is the committee's opportunity to consider the policy set out in the SL1, as it's not possible to amend once it has been laid in the Assembly Business Office. And just, Peter, it says that companies that are in financial difficulty as a result of coronavirus or otherwise. I thought that these were
there are coronavirus
specific.
The or otherwise is probably a bad phrase to use. It is kind of coronavirus specific, and all of the criteria set down within it are coronavirus specific. So that's a poor choice of wording.
It's not. I'm just. It's not in the. No, that's great.
That was our bad.
So are members content then with the policy direction as outlined, and it is the same as we previously have agreed?
Yes.
Chair, it might be worth going back to, obviously the committee has agreed this, but it might be just worth talking to the department, and we can do it through our Gallo readout, about anticipation on this continuing. Obviously the parent legislation, I'm going to say this off the top of my head and I'm happy to be corrected, but I think it's just that it's ultimately to the end of the financial year. Although I could be wrong, but it might be useful to try and pin down whether or not the department sees this continuing further quarters? Like we're moving this forward quarterly. Do they anticipate a further quarter beyond this one? Because that would effectively take us kind of to the end of the financial year and beyond.
Just reading it because it's not saying permanent rules are being drafted in Britain, which the permanent rules for the North will be drafted, will not be finalised or enforced until after the 30th of September.
So that would suggest a redesign, but it might just be useful to get a clarification on that from the department. If members are content, we'll ask for that.
So it says the regulations which the department is proposing to make are to extend the relevant period for a maximum of 6 months in order to create adequate opportunity for permanent rules to be made.
Yeah, it might just be good to pin down just how that is going to work and what they anticipate those new permanent rules might be.
Yep. Peter, do we want to do some matters arising, or do we want?
Down to members, we can switch everything into agreement via email. I appreciate it's been a fairly meaty session, and we can just do everything else via email. We've covered our legislation, so if members are content, we can
Members
come
happy?
to a
No?
close.
We can use IVR, absolutely.
Yes, IVR, yes, what you said.
I'll set up that phone.
They're not a prescribed organisation.
We're just proposing that we deal with matters arising and correspondence by email.
Great.
Thank you, Chair. So,
Hold on.
AOB and time of day.
Over here.
Well, that was our original. That's
Okay,
our
okay.
one we're deferring.
Okay, so moving on then to item number 11, which is any other business, and none has been indicated.
Not touched.
Although, just to say, Peter, in relation to the utility regulator does have a statement out today.
Yes.
And around the energy costs, I had suggested to yourself that we would seek to get a briefing from the utility regulator
Chair,
quite
if
soon.
we can get agreement to that, if members agree, we bring in the utility regulator as soon as.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chair, I would concur with that because I think that's going to be a very important issue as we enter the winter months. Also, I think that we probably need to schedule a conversation with our airports around the announcement of Ryanair withdrawing their services yesterday, because that's going to have a significant impact on the travel industry.
And I take it our new minister will be in with us soon.
Yes, we had hoped that this would have been the time, but he's on leave this week. So he's very keen to come in front of the committee, he said.
Cut that out.
We bring him in as soon as we can.
Okay, so item number 12 then is the date, time and place of the next meeting. The committee will next meet on Wednesday the 15th of September.
That's our official next meeting, Chair. What we're looking at is a strategy session on the 8th at Queen's.
And we're planning to have that at Queen's, so the team will confirm further details with members. So that's us. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound.